The flight attendant's hands were shaking, not from turbulence, not from the altitude, but from something far more dangerous at 35,000 feet, the volcanic temper of Francis Albert Sinatra, when the world refused to bend to his will. It was late 1965, somewhere between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, and the chairman of the board had just reduced a young woman to tears over a scotch served 2 degrees too warm and a napkin placed an inch to the left of perfection. The cabin had transformed into something that felt less like an airplane and more like a floating Vegas lounge, all golden light and crystal tumblers, cigarettes and tailored suits. This was the era when flying was still a privilege, when the champagne was real, and the men in first class were legends whose names appeared in newspapers the next morning. Tonight, 2 of those legends were Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Frank's voice cut through the pressurized silence like broken glass. Every passenger pretended to study their magazines. Every crew member discovered urgent business in the galley, because when Frank exploded, you looked away. You always looked away. It was the unspoken rule of survival in the orbit of Sinatra. The young flight attendant tried to apologize, tried to explain the policy, the limitations, the rules she didn't write but had to obey. Her voice trembled. Her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. Not yet, not in front of him. She had grown up with his voice pouring from her parents' radio, the soundtrack to first dances and last chances. Now he was 3 feet away, close enough to destroy her with words alone. Across the aisle, Dean Martin sat with a comic book in one hand and a cigarette in the other, nursing what everyone assumed was whiskey, but was actually ginger ale. To the world, he was the lovable drunk, the jester who didn't care. But that was the mask. In reality, Dean was the most sober, observant man in that cabin. He watched the girl's face crumble. He saw the dignity being stripped away, piece by piece, and something inside him, something quiet and unbreakable, said enough. Dean didn't shout. He didn't stand up dramatically. He simply folded his comic book, placed it on his lap, and looked at Frank with those heavy-lidded eyes that had witnessed 1,000 cruelties in this business. The look wasn't angry. It was disappointed. It was the look of an older brother watching a sibling break a sacred vow. What happened next lasted maybe 90 seconds. No cameras captured it. No journalists documented it. But when Dean Martin stood up that day and walked down that narrow aisle with his familiar loose-limbed grace, he wasn't just defending a stranger. He was drawing a line that Frank Sinatra, the most powerful entertainer in the world, had never seen drawn before. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that flight, to the moment when the king of cool became something far more important. A man who refused to look away. On paper, they were equals. 2 poor boys from immigrant families who had clawed their way out of smoke, filled bars, and into the thin, rarefied air of American immortality. Frank Sinatra from the tenements of Hoboken, where his mother ran illegal abortions to keep food on the table. Dean Martin from the steel mills of Steubenville, Ohio, where his father cut hair for miners who could barely afford a 15-cent shave. But anyone who'd ever been in a room with them knew the truth about the architecture of their friendship. Frank was the thunder. Dean was the weather that followed. Their bond was forged in dingy clubs and cramped dressing rooms in the early 50s, before the neon crowns of Las Vegas had fully settled on their heads. Back then, you could still hear the rattle of dishes in the kitchen behind the stage, still smell the coffee burning in the pot. Frank was already a storm, walking into rooms as if the air itself owed him money. Dean was the opposite. Light footsteps, half-muttered jokes, the clink of ice in a glass that was never quite as strong as people thought. Frank pulled Dean closer because he recognized something essential in him, a timing, an ease, the way Dean let silence breathe between punchlines. Frank needed that calm. He was all hunger and sharp edges, and Dean's presence felt like the only soft place he could land. But with that affection came a current of power that shaped everything between them. When Frank said we're going, they went. When Frank said we're done, careers ended. The stories whispered in casino back hallways painted the picture clearly. The photographer in Miami who clicked the shutter one too many times and left with a broken camera. The columnist in New York who wrote an unflattering line about Ava Gardner and found herself blacklisted from every major publication. The young casino worker who accidentally spilled a drink on Frank's custom suit and was fired before the liquid dried, his hospitality career destroyed by a single phone call Frank made to every hotel owner in Nevada. Dean had perfected his response to these explosions. The knowing look, the perfectly timed joke that redirected Frank's attention, the smooth exit that removed him from the blast radius without actually confronting what was happening. He became the buffer, absorbing the impact of Frank's volatility, managing the hurricane without the hurricane ever realizing it was being managed. It was an unspoken pact within the Rat Pack. You didn't challenge the chairman. You covered the damage. You kept the machine running, because you all lived off the electricity Frank generated. By 1965, they weren't just entertainers. They were American royalty with their own laws. The Rat Pack was a sovereign nation where Frank's word was absolute. But there are places where even absolute power feels different, more fragile. Frank's private Martin 404 aircraft, the Christina, was one of them. Up there, 7 miles above the earth, sealed tight against the thin air and dark sky, the usual escape routes didn't exist. The cabin was a flying kingdom fitted with a bar and plush seating. But on this particular afternoon, the air pressure inside was rising far faster than the altimeter. Frank was already in a mood his inner circle recognized with dread. He was looking for a target, needing to vent the pressure building behind his eyes. And tragically, that target presented itself in the form of a young flight attendant who was simply trying to do her job. She didn't know the history. She didn't know the rules. She didn't know she was walking into a cage with a wounded lion. But every friendship has a breaking point. Every silent witness eventually finds their voice. For Dean Martin, that moment came at the worst possible time, in the worst possible place, trapped in a metal tube 7 miles above the earth, with nowhere for anyone to run, and nowhere for Frank's temper to cool. To the world, Dean Martin was a beautiful wreck, the patron saint of the perpetual happy hour who stumbled through life with a cigarette dangling from his lip and a tumbler of amber liquid sloshing in his hand. He moved through nightclubs and sound stages as if the world were one long joke, and he was the only one in on the punchline. People loved that about him. In a business built on desperation and razor-sharp ambition, here was a man who seemed gloriously unaffected, effortlessly untouchable. But if you looked close enough to see the truth, you knew better. The liquid in his glass was apple juice, sometimes ginger ale, poured into heavy crystal tumblers to complete the illusion. The slurred words on stage were part of a performance crafted with almost surgical precision. Dean understood the genius of that persona. If they thought you were too drunk to care, they stopped expecting you to play the vicious political games that destroyed so many careers. The drunk could leave parties early, forget important names, avoid the machinery that ground up performers like meat. That calculated laziness was his armor, and it let him move through Hollywood like a secret agent of decency. Underneath the tuxedo in deep tan lived the soul of Dino Crocetti, the barber's son from Steubenville, Ohio. His father, Gaetano, had stood 14 hours a day in a cramped shop that smelled of talcum and bay rum, treating every coal miner who sat in his chair like royalty. That was the lesson burned into Dean's DNA. Dignity wasn't about fame or power or how many people knew your name. It was how you treated the man holding the broom when he could do nothing for you in return. Dean's kindness operated in shadows, almost like a covert mission. There was the extra on a movie set, shivering in a thin coat, who found herself with a complete new wardrobe the next day, told it was studio policy so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. The session musician whose cancer treatment bills vanished overnight, paid by an anonymous check that traced back to Dean's business manager. The Vegas waitress whose broken-down car was replaced with a reliable Chevrolet, title already signed over, no return address. He never wanted credit. To Dean, charity that required an audience wasn't charity, it was just another performance. This was the friction that constantly sparked beneath his friendship with Frank. Sinatra wielded power like a broadsword, loud, heavy, designed to make the room stop breathing when he entered. Frank demanded tribute, needed acknowledgement, collected debts like trophies. Dean moved through the world like smoke, preferring to share a sandwich with a stagehand than dine with studio heads. He understood something Frank never grasped. Fear isn't respect. You can buy silence, demand submission, but respect is earned in quiet moments when you think nobody's watching. For 30 years, Dean had navigated this difference with shrugs and perfectly timed jokes. He loved Frank like a brother, but often went home, carrying the weight of compromised silence, sickened by the wreckage Frank left behind. He'd become an expert at looking away, at finding humor in horror to preserve the peace. But sitting on that plane, watching the flight attendant's hands tremble as she absorbed Frank's verbal assault, the humor finally died. In her terrified face, Dean saw his mother, his sister, every person his father had served with dignity in that Steubenville barbershop, and in that moment, 30 years of diplomatic silence became unbearable. The mask felt impossibly heavy. The apple juice tasted like betrayal, and Dean Martin was tired of pretending he couldn't see the bullies. The comic book stayed open in Dean's lap for exactly 12 seconds after Frank's voice turned venomous. 12 seconds while the flight attendant's carefully rehearsed apology crumbled into stammering fragments. 12 seconds while every other passenger discovered urgent fascination with briefcases and magazines, their eyes suddenly unable to meet the scene unfolding 3 rows ahead. 12 seconds while the cabin pressure seemed to triple, squeezing the air from everyone's lungs except Dean's, who sat perfectly still, watching his best friend systematically destroy a stranger's dignity at 35,000 feet. Then something inside Dean Martin snapped with an almost audible crack. He folded the comic book with deliberate care, the soft rustle of pages sounding like thunder in the terrified silence. When he stood up, there was no sway, no stumble, no reaching for the overhead compartment to steady himself. The loose-limbed, boozy shuffle he'd perfected for cameras and nightclub stages was gone, replaced by a movement so deliberate and sober it made the other passengers more afraid than Frank's shouting ever could. This wasn't the lovable drunk rising for another scotch. This was Dino Cricchetti, the barber's son from Steubenville, a man who knew what it meant to be spoken to like dirt on someone's shoe, and who had finally decided he was done watching it happen to others. Frank was still mid-tirade, his finger pointed like a loaded weapon at the girl's face, dissecting her incompetence with surgical cruelty. He was too lost in the red haze of his own rage to notice Dean approach, too accustomed to a world where his voice was the only sound that mattered. The humiliation had become sport now, the drink forgotten in favor of the more intoxicating pleasure of watching someone break. Then Dean's shadow fell across Frank's armrest, and the cabin went deathly still. Dean stepped directly into the line of fire, placing his body between the chairman of the board and the trembling flight attendant. It was a physical intercession that transformed the narrow aisle into a battlefield, his presence suddenly occupying all the available oxygen in first class. The girl looked up at him through tears she'd been fighting to hold back, her hands still shaking against the service cart, and saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Not pity. Not performance. Just bedrock solid decency rising from beneath 30 years of carefully maintained masks. When Dean finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual warmth or humor. No trace of the easygoing sidekick. No hint of the perpetual party guest. This was something ancient and immovable speaking. something that had been buried under years of diplomatic silence and was finally, inevitably, breaking through to the surface. "Frank," he said quietly, the name sounding less like a greeting and more like a prayer for sanity. "She's just doing her job. You're a big man. You don't need to be small to her." The words hung in the pressurized air like a verdict. Frank's mouth opened, then closed, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, then something darker that made even the pilots listening through the cockpit door later admit they'd considered requesting emergency clearance. For perhaps the first time in a decade, Francis Albert Sinatra had no idea what to say. The volcanic rage that had been building met something it couldn't burn through. Genuine disappointment from the one man whose opinion actually mattered. Dean didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't make it a spectacle for the frozen passengers. He simply stood there, holding Frank's stare with those heavy-lidded eyes that had witnessed 1,000 of these explosions, and finally, refused to look away. The unspoken message passed between them like electricity. "You can be better than this. I know you can be better than this." The flight attendant had become a witness to something that transcended airline policy and warm scotch. She was watching the real power structure of the most famous friendship in show business reveal itself in real time, seeing that the drunk wasn't really drunk and the king wasn't really in control. In that narrow aisle, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, she understood she was seeing two legends without their masks, and only one of them was still recognizable as human. Frank sank back into his seat, the air hissing out of him like a punctured balloon. The rage evaporated, replaced by stunned, sullen silence. He turned to the window, staring out at clouds that looked like cotton and felt like accusation, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Dean didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He simply walked back to his seat with that same unhurried grace, picked up his comic book, and turned the page as if the last 90 seconds hadn't just shattered the fundamental architecture of their friendship. For the remaining 40 minutes to Las Vegas, the only sounds in the cabin were the steady hum of engines and the quiet, steadying breaths of a young woman who had just learned what courage looked like when it mattered most. And somewhere, in that pressurized silence, everyone understood they'd witnessed something that would never make the newspapers, but would define these men forever. The moment Dean Martin taught Frank Sinatra that respect isn't optional, and friendship isn't the same as enabling cruelty. Las Vegas runs on noise, slot machines, showgirls, brass sections blasting into the desert night. But for 3 long days after that flight, the loudest sound on the Strip was an absence. Frank Sinatra not speaking to Dean Martin. The silence rippled through the Sands Hotel like a seismic shift, felt by everyone from pit bosses to cocktail waitresses, who suddenly found themselves navigating around an invisible fracture in the foundation of their glittering world. Dean went on stage each night with that same unhurried stride, delivering his show with effortless charm, while the insiders whispered in dressing rooms thick with hairspray and cigarette smoke. He joked about his ex-wives, about his golf game, about his own supposed uselessness, but never once mentioned Frank. The crowd roared, unaware that beneath the lights he carried the invisible bruise of a friendship pushed past its breaking point. Up in his penthouse suite, Frank proud like a wounded emperor, surrounded by the usual entourage of yes-men who suddenly didn't know what to say. He'd seen him angry before, seen him destroy careers with a single phone call, but this was different. This was shame, wearing the mask of rage, and shame was an emotion Frank Sinatra had spent his entire life refusing to acknowledge, because beneath all the volcanic temper and hair-trigger pride lived something surprisingly fragile, a desperate need to be loved by people who actually knew him. The hangers-on didn't count, the starlets and senators didn't matter, but Dean mattered. Dean had never asked him for anything, never used their friendship as currency, never showed up with his hand out. Losing that felt like losing oxygen. On the 4th night, Frank appeared at Dean's dressing room without warning, without bodyguards, without the armor of his usual entourage, just a man in an expensive suit, carrying the weight of sleepless nights. What passed between them in that small room remained locked behind closed doors, sealed by the kind of friendship that understood some conversations were too sacred for witnesses. The reconciliation didn't happen with grand gestures or lengthy explanations. Frank simply poured 2 drinks, slid one across the makeup table, and met Dean's eyes in the mirror. The silence that passed between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was the comfortable, worn-in silence of brothers who know that some bonds are strong enough to survive the truth. But the real resolution didn't happen in that dressing room. A week later, Frank personally tracked down the flight attendant during her next Vegas layover, finding her in the crew hotel where she was preparing for the return flight to Los Angeles. No photographers, no press release, no publicist spinning the encounter into favorable headlines. Just Frank Sinatra, alone, looking smaller somehow without the rage that had made him seem 10 feet tall on that airplane. He didn't make excuses or blame his behavior on stress or the 1,000 pressures of celebrity. He simply acknowledged what he'd done, admitted it was wrong, and thanked her for her professionalism in a situation where she deserved so much better. The apology lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it rewrote the history of her life. As he turned to leave, she asked why he'd decided to make this right. His answer was delivered in that unmistakable voice that had sold 100 million records, because Dean was right. And when Dean Martin tells you you're being a bastard, you're probably being a bastard. The friendship survived, stitched back together with the fragile thread of accountability. Frank's temper still flared. His demands still echoed through casino corridors. But those who paid attention noticed the subtle changes. The casual cruelty toward service workers quietly diminished, replaced by something that almost resembled consideration. Dean had held a mirror up to a legend and forced him to look at his own reflection until he decided he didn't like what he saw. The intervention hadn't just protected one woman on one flight. It had drawn a line Frank didn't know existed, and in crossing back over it, he'd admitted something he rarely acknowledged to anyone. He was capable of being wrong. The photograph lived in a shoebox for 27 years before anyone understood it was evidence of a miracle. Tucked between faded boarding passes and crew identification cards, beneath recipe cards stained with decades of family dinners, it waited like a time capsule from an era when flying still felt like floating through heaven instead of being processed through cattle chutes. In 1992, in a modest Connecticut living room that smelled of lavender and old books, a grandmother sat with her teenage granddaughter, sorting through the accumulated artifacts of a life spent at altitude. The girl expected stories about turbulence and celebrity sightings, the usual glamorous debris of a career, serving cocktails to the famous. Instead, she pulled out a slightly blurred Polaroid that made her grandmother go completely still. The image showed a young woman in a crisp Pan Am uniform, her eyes still bright with recently shed tears, standing beside a devastatingly handsome man in a dark suit. He wasn't posing like a celebrity. No practiced smile, no calculated angle for publicity. Dean Martin was captured mid-laugh, head tilted back, eyes closed in genuine joy, one protective arm around her shoulders, as if they'd been friends for decades, instead of strangers who'd shared 90 seconds of crisis in an airplane aisle. On the back, written in her own careful cursive that had faded to ghost ink, were 4 words that contained an entire universe: the day Dean saved me. The story poured out then, 3 decades of silence finally breaking like a dam. She described the terror of that afternoon in 1965, the way Frank's rage had made the cabin feel like it was shrinking around her, the awful certainty that her career was ending because a famous man didn't like the temperature of his scotch. But mostly, she talked about Dean, the exact weight of his hand on her shoulder as he guided her away from the verbal assault, the way he smelled of Old Spice and expensive tobacco, the absolute calm in his voice when he told her everything would be all right, as if defending strangers from powerful bullies was something he did every Tuesday. That 90-second intervention hadn't just saved her job, it had rewritten her understanding of her own worth. For 27 years, whenever someone tried to make her feel small, whenever a boss shouted or a customer demeaned her, she remembered that Dean Martin had thought she was worth defending against the most powerful entertainer on earth. That memory became armor she wore for the rest of her life, and she'd passed it down like a family heirloom. When her son faced a bullying supervisor, she told him about the man who stood in an airplane aisle, teaching him that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of violence. When her daughter struggled with an abusive relationship, she shared how real strength looked like protection, not domination. She wasn't alone in carrying these invisible gifts. As the years passed and fear of career retaliation faded, other witnesses finally felt safe enough to speak. A studio executive revealed in his memoir how Dean had quietly stopped production on a major film, refusing to continue until discriminatory hiring practices were changed, never making speeches or calling press conferences, just politely declining to show up until things were fixed. That quiet stand affected thousands of workers across 3 studios who never knew Dean's name but benefited from his conscience. The pattern repeated itself in testimonies from musicians, stagehands, and crew members who discovered that Dean moved through Hollywood like a guardian angel, specializing in small interventions that changed entire life trajectories. He never retold these stories on talk shows or used them to polish his image. In an industry obsessed with calculated charity events, he understood that kindness requiring an audience wasn't kindness at all. Frank's daughter Nancy would later reveal that her father spoke often about Dean's courage in his final years, admitting with rare humility that Dean was the only man who could tell him no and make it stick. He was proud, she said, that someone had loved him enough to risk their friendship by telling him the truth. The grandmother placed the photograph back in the shoebox, her fingers tracing Dean's laughing face one final time. In that faded image lived proof that true immortality isn't measured in record sales or box office receipts, but in the quiet courage of standing up when everyone else sits down, in the ripples of decency that spread through generations of lives he'd never know he'd touched. The trouble with legends is that time tends to flatten the people inside them, sanding down the contradictions until all that remains is a tuxedo, a cigarette, and a glass raised in permanent toast. But the cost of being good in a bad town is almost always paid in loneliness, and Dean Martin understood this better than most. He carried that knowledge like a stone in his pocket through every glittering Vegas night where the champagne tasted like compromise, and every Hollywood premiere where handshakes came with invisible price tags. There were roles he never got because he wouldn't play the games that greased the machinery of stardom. Studio heads who wanted favors found themselves politely declined with that same easy smile. Producers who expected silence about their predatory behavior discovered Dean had urgent business elsewhere. Directors who demanded complicity in their cruelty to young actors watched the parts go to men more willing to bend their spines for success. The Rat Pack adventures that became legend often happened without him, the wild nights that stretched into reckless dawns, the destructive binges that would be retold as heroic excess. Frank would call, and Dean would find a reason to be somewhere else, driving home to his kids in his Thunderbird, leaving the chaos to burn itself out without the conscience they couldn't afford to have watching. His children remember a different man entirely from the stumbling drunk America loved. They remember a father who woke before dawn to call each of them at exactly 6 in the morning, no matter where he was performing, asking about homework and heartbreaks with genuine interest that never felt like obligation. They remember him teaching them that how you treat the valet parking your car reveals more about your character than how you treat the studio executive greenlighting your movie. The lesson he'd learned in his father's barbershop became the inheritance he passed down. Dignity isn't negotiable, and kindness isn't weakness. When his son Dean Paul died in a military jet crash in 1987, something fundamental broke inside him that never fully healed. The performances became mechanical, the famous ease replaced by visible effort. He retreated to quiet corners of La Famiglia restaurant, staring at plates of pasta he barely touched, surrounded by ghosts only he could see. But even in that darkness, the invisible people he'd helped across 4 decades showed up. Musicians whose hospital bills he'd paid, crew members he'd defended from abusive directors, waitresses whose children's college tuition he'd quietly covered. They came bearing casseroles and company, sitting with him in comfortable silence, repaying debts he'd never expected them to remember. At Dean's funeral in 1995, Frank Sinatra stood broken at the podium, his legendary voice cracking as he called Dean the best of us. Not the funniest or the most talented, though he was both. The best. The man who'd kept them all human when the machinery of fame tried to turn them into monsters. Frank's public admission carried the weight of private conversations, of lessons learned in airplane aisles 30 years earlier, of a friendship that survived because one man loved another enough to demand he be better. The flight attendant kept that photograph in her wallet until the day she died, those 4 faded words serving as a compass through every difficult decision. He stood up. Dean Martin's greatest performance wasn't delivered on any stage or captured by any camera. It was the quiet, relentless courage of being a good man in a business that rarely rewarded goodness. Long after the last record skips and the final marquee burns out, one stubborn question remains in every space where power meets vulnerability. When it mattered, did you stand up? Dean Martin did. And that, more than any song or movie, is why he will never truly disappear.